Good evening, dear friends. The operational situation at the front by the end of the 24th of February. Today we will talk in more detail about the Bakhmut, Avdeevka, and Zaporizhzhia sectors of the front, about important news. But we will start with the Lyman direction. The area of Turnov, the area of Yampolovka, fighting continues, assault actions on the part of the enemy. Today, the APU has undertaken a number of counterattacks, so we do not record significant changes in the direction of the Yampolovka, but at the same time, there is pressure. It remains in the Yarlaptiv area, and the enemy is still pressing in the northern part of the round beam in the western direction. But it should also be noted that there is not that amount of armored vehicles which was before. It is now focused, and most likely, as I said on the previous broadcast, they will take more serious assault actions in the near future, but now they are preparing. Perhaps the bet is just the same on weather conditions, their deterioration, as soon as there is fog, strong wind, rain, downpour. Yes, as soon as the effectiveness of aerial reconnaissance is minimal, the enemy will begin assault operations. No changes for tonight. I will also comment on Bologorovka. After lunch, there was news from this section of the front. Here, Russian troops also continue their assault operations, continue their attacks. If earlier we said that they attacked with the support of armored vehicles, by the evening, we state that the fighting is going on in assault groups. That is, without the support of armored vehicles, they launched a number of attacks again. With the widest possible coverage that is available here, attacked with small infantry groups, we also do not fix any changes. The fighting within the gray zone. But it should be noted that the pressure from the enemy is quite high, and the situation is also quite complicated, because a lot of artillery strikes are being carried out, and there is a possibility that the enemy will also increase the pressure of tactical aviation with aerial bombs on this section of the front, because Bologorovka is also a very serious strategic point for them, which would later allow more seriously attack in the direction of Seversk, and at the same time, by advancing to Grigorovka, align the front line in the Kremen Forest aka Serebryansky Forest aka Serebryansky Forestry. By the way, there were comments on it directly from our fighters. Yesterday these comments were on the situation as a whole. The situation is very difficult, because the last 6 months, there have been very heavy battles. Although we have stated minimal changes over this period, it is still necessary to add that here the enemy is working attrition. It is attrition, so the battles are going on daily in several areas. It is possible to restrain for the most part. But the main bet, of course, is on attrition, that the enemy is working. We turn to the Bakhmut direction. Minimal adjustments added to the gray zone in the Bogdanovka districts. Well, now let's talk about this in more detail. It means that Russian troops took a number of assault actions, both in Bogdanovka itself, and southeast of it, along the fields, attacked along the forest belt in the direction of the railway platform of the Vyonovka station. There were shots today where the enemy carried out attacks, that is, he passed a little more than half of the way to the forest belt, and by the evening, we state that the assault actions on the part of the enemy are continuing. At the same time, I repeat, there were attempts to improve the tactical situation in Bogdanovka itself, and between these positions. There were also attacks on the northeastern outskirts, but again in the field area. In the direction of the forest belt, attempts were made to improve the tactical situation of the Russian troops. By the end of the day, we state that the fighting continues. The result for clarification is natural. There were also a number of attacks by Russian troops in the cemetery area in the western direction, that is, along the road 00506, and in the area of the Popovsky Forest. Attempts were also made to enter its western part. It was possible to repel a number of attacks, but at the same time, the enemy does not reduce the pressure between the Popovsky Forest and Kromov, pressing in a southerly direction, in the direction of Ivanovsky. According to Ivanovsky, attempts are being made to advance along Sedovolya Street, as well as attempts were made in the area of the intersection, to hook Shidna Street with Shasinaya Street. Shosynaya Street, that is, Vector A was not only in the north, but also in the west direction. At the same time, there is still activity in about this area. The gray and red zone, the junction in the western direction, was attacked. The fighting continues, the fighting is heavy. Let's just say it as it is. The fights are heavy. The armed forces of Ukraine are taking all necessary measures to stabilize the situation and dislodge the Russian troops, but let's just say, the number that has gone, that is, it's several dozen, yes, but it's not so fast. Well, the enemy is very seriously increasing pressure on the settlement, while simultaneously attacking from the Chernobyl Garden Association, as we talked about on previous broadcasts. Therefore, the situation remains under clarification. The fighting continues. We proceed to the Avdeevka direction, according to the Standard 1, without any changes. The main pressure is now on the enemy, to the west of Avdeevka, as Sohim, and the west of Avdeevka itself. Today, news was published by our fighters, including that Russian troops entered the settlement, but before that, our troops left the settlement in order not to be surrounded, because the enemy could also interrupt the supply routes. We just talked with you on previous broadcasts about the fact that Russian troops are not only attacking eastern Swala. There is a vector of attacks from Avdeevsky as Sohim. We talked about it. Let's go through the changes right away. We said on the previous broadcast that they attacked along the forest belt in the south direction, which means that they also descended into one of the forest belts from the beam area. But then we added a remark that this remains to be clarified, because the result is unknown. Well, actually, what is that is? We note the enemy's advance on a front section up to 165 kilometers wide, to a depth of up to 1 kilometer. It means that the eastern part, the central part, is under the control of the enemy. He has not appeared in the western part yet. Well, according to the previous frames, it means that the enemy has published a video where he sets his flag in the eastern part of the settlement, so it's already a matter of time before they enter the western part. Well, as soon as the frames are published, we will add this area to red. At the same time, there are naturally attacks along the road section about 0542 in the western direction. There are further attempts to break through along the beam, and there are attempts in the direction of the typical. But I would say it is more in the direction of the typical. Reconnaissance by combat. Derg naturally show activity. On the part of the APU, very serious work is being done with aerobombers, that is, they are working with drones in Pevi, including not only Avdeevka. Avdeevsky as a Sohim is very tight. In other words, we have been saying a lot lately that the enemy is pressing, but from the side of the APU, everything that is possible, they are now being taken from their side. Naturally, trying to compensate for the projectile hunger, and in singing with drones and drones with drops. Therefore, now a lot of fees are being held, including mine, on the drones themselves, Mavics. Because it is extremely necessary. Plus, the enemy has been using tactics lately, especially recently small infantry groups. And of course, all this is necessary for aerial reconnaissance, because the territory where it can potentially attack is becoming much wider from previous periods. And alas, this tactic works with numerical superiority. Well, based on what we see today on the map. As for the north, there are also a number of messages by the end of the day. I will correct the gray zone here, in the next half hour after the broadcast, because there are a number of reports that Russian troops managed to break through a little more in the eastern part. There are reports of a counterattack by the APU, but in general, this information still needs further clarification. But here too, the enemy is pressing. We said that he is pressing not only from the south to the north, but also Avdeevka itself from east to west. Naturally, the stabilization of the front line along Lastocken will allow the enemy to attack from another direction, that is, in the southwestern direction from Lastocken. Similarly, attempts can be made in the direction of the Thin One, in any case, to strengthen the assault actions. They can in the near future. This is the situation we have in the Avdeevka direction. According to Pervomaysky and Novelsky, we do not note any changes, but there are fighting, they continue. The APU managed to repel a number of attacks, and the direction of Krasnogorovka today, also after lunch. There were a lot of reports that Russian troops are advancing on this sector of the front, and that they have a number of successes. But these are statements on their part. On our part, there are also a number of statements that somewhere it was possible to successfully repel a number of attacks. These positions mean that they are west of the veins of the Trudovskaya mine shaft, that is, Russian troops are making further attempts to advance along Geologichная Street, along the fields, but today, by the end of the day, I would say, this is more DRG and conducted reconnaissance by battle than DRG. I mean, the activity of the DRG is high, but in no way not assault groups, because the support is not the same yet. Although this is also one of the goals of the Russian troops now, to disperse the forces as a whole, in the Kurakovsky direction as much as possible, because it is along it that they are looking for a gap in the defense. Well, plus to all this, the last counterattack by the APU in the victory area, it showed that in fact, despite all the difficulties, despite the shell starvation, the APU can counterattack and do it effectively, despite the huge difficulties that we have now. Therefore, now one of the tactics is just to disperse even more of the power of superannuation with all these attacks, and the activity of the DRG as a whole in the Kurakovsky direction. According to Novomikhailivka, without significant changes, the fighting is still within the gray zone. The basis is of course still the southern part. The southeastern part along Academician Timoryazov Street is making further attempts to advance, and there is another street north of it. There is also a fairly high activity. There was no information that the Russian troops managed to gain a foothold, but it is quite dynamic in this area, I would say so. Quite dynamic, with varying success. In the Ugledar direction, we have seen activity north of Shevchenko in recent days, but we have not recorded any other changes. That is, then you managed to repel the attack, and a fairly serious attack, with the support of armored vehicles, attacked Russian troops in the northern direction, did not take any more. That is, there may also have been a bet that the APU, as well as in other areas, would experience difficulties, as well as in Avdeevka. But here, we see very, very effective work, it should be noted. But in other areas, such as Avdeevskaya, there is a significant superiority in tactical aviation, and even more so the use of air bombs. This is what the Russian command is betting on now. We proceed further to the Zaporozhye direction of work, and we will also talk about recruitment. Let's start with him. It means that our attacks continue along the so-called Surovikin line, including in the western direction from the ledge. Today, we have slightly adjusted the situation in the locality of Rabatina, but it comes very, very contradictory. Well, let's get started. The first one. Today, the footage was published by Russian military officers. Yesterday's footage, according to the statement of our fighters directly from the field, it happened yesterday. So on the previous broadcast, we talked to you, and added a gray zone, that along the street, I said then, Cherivna, 2 units of Russian armored vehicles drove, so from west to east. This moment was discussed. The second video was published today. The landing was in a hurry, so it's already north of Cranial Street. So they entered one of the structures, the second frame, and took assault actions from it. According to the fighters from the field, this is yesterday's video, and the situation was stabilized. The Russian troops were not allowed to gain a foothold. At the same time, on the part of the Russian troops, the Russian media, I would say, today it is not so much the Russian media soldiers as the Russian media that report that they have managed to gain a foothold in the central part and even north of the central street, that is Cherivnaya Street, in a number of positions. Perhaps this means just the same geolinking to this video, but so far we have only corrected the gray zone where the enemy also attacked, because according to reports from the AFU, fighters managed to stabilize the situation, but the fighting continues. That is, they did not allow the Russian troops to gain a foothold. But, at the same time, we see quite serious pressure from them, quite serious, considering where the enemy appears. I can't comment on my opinion right now, I won't, because there's not enough information. Well, according to our work, we will probably end up with the fact that it is contradictory. On the one hand, we see that the statement on the part of the AFU fighters that they managed to knock out, not to allow them to gain a foothold, on the part of the enemy, that they on the contrary, gained a foothold. I think within 48 hours, maybe even 24, we will see the full picture. But really, what is true, is that there are very heavy assault operations. As for the western part, footage of a new attack by Russian troops was published today, and just the same armored vehicles were stopped approximately in this area of the gray zone. We talked to you a few days ago about the fact that there was a counterattack by the AFU. It was possible to throw back the Western units, the Russian troops, where they entered, and to capture 4 Russian soldiers, and also manage to dislodge them from the forest belt, not to let them gain a foothold. At the same time, again, a new attack, it was possible to repel it to the forest belt. So based on the frames that are available today, and comments, let's just say, it is not yet clear, because there are also Russian troops in the center, but these are yesterday's shots according to statements. And at the same time, to the west, but the west was stopped. Naturally, you could not stop the courts in this area, if they did not control the center. Well, there is such information here, I think you understand everything. Therefore, a little later, within 48 hours, we will talk in more detail, when there will be more drone footage, and accordingly, information. So far, there are very heavy battles going on, and we really see that the Russian troops are not giving up trying, although they are no longer attacking the same number of armored vehicles that they were before. 30 units are initially involved, then supported by 4 units. Yes, now we are stating 2, 2 and 2. Attack with the support of 2 units, 3 attacks with the support of 2 armored vehicles each. But nevertheless, the enemy drives into the settlement, so there are very heavy close-range shooting battles, and intensive artillery work. This is the situation we have in the Zaporozhye direction. Although by the evening, there are a number of reports from the enemy, I will also quote this. I will not say that they only say that they captured a settlement, advanced there to the center. There is a statement that the situation is not the same as they presented before, that they have entered some part, but there are heavy battles going on. Perhaps this is just the same, the situation has already become more or less clear, and the APU really knocked them out, but this will already be seen, in the context of 48 hours. They asked me to comment in more detail about the attacks that took place, including the fact that we focused on Seladov with you at that time, and to talk more about it from the following broadcasts. How will this happen? Yes, let's talk more, since you are interested in this topic. Well, let's move on to one of the news.